that gender equality is important to everybody, really. Gender equality is really critical. And when it comes to work and organizational psychology, I do think a lot of the things that we do when we're talking about workplaces, when we're talking about jobs, when we're talking about careers, gender plays such an important role. So I think you can't understand leadership without understanding gender. You can't understand jobs and work and career progression without understanding gender, because these things are so very gendered. And I think it's really important to note that progress towards gender equality, or the way in which gender inequality manifests itself, really varies across different places. If we think about Latin America, gender equality might be playing itself out slightly differently. There might be different stages of development in terms of where organizations are, where policy and practice and legislation is, and those sorts of things. So I think it really is important to be having all different regions in the world looking at it, because it will tell us all sorts of different things. I run an institute here in Australia called the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And one of the things that we really try and do here is that we do both research and practice. So one of the really big pillars that we have in terms of our principles and how we work is that when it comes to gender equality, there should always be a really clear evidence base. We should make sure that it's effective and it's going to work. And we don't know that unless we have an evidence base. More specifically, I guess one of the other principles that we use at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is fixed systems and structures, not women. So for us, that's a real sort of overarching principle. And what I mean by that is that all of the evidence points to the fact that gender inequalities really are driven by systems and structures. So cultures within organizations, norms and stereotypes, expectations about what success looks like and what leadership looks like, and how that then relates to our stereotypes about men and women. So many of the inequalities are coming from there. So when it comes to fixing those inequalities, then that's where we have to start. And that's not always an easy place to start. For many people, an easy place to start in gender equality is what we call a fix the women approach. So they do women's leadership courses and try and give women more skills for leadership, or they do motivation and career planning. But a lack of leadership skills and a lack of planning is not the reason that we have gender inequality. So that's not the underlying problem. Macho cultures within organizations, in-group favoritism, where those in charge, who are often men, give people like them, other men, the promotions or the good jobs or the pay rises and those sorts of things. So it's those cultures that we have to change rather than trying to fix women. The things that's really tricky about changing culture and changing systems and structures is that those things really take time. Those things are hard to do. You can't change them overnight. It requires big organizational buy-in. It requires buy-in from senior managers, and often the change process is slow. So often, organizations are not particularly keen to do them because they're difficult and they take time. And what organizations often want is quick wins, or they want to be able to show that they're doing something different and show them quite quickly. I think it's also about having a little bit of a mindset of change about how long it's going to take and how easy it's going to be, and that we can't just go through with tick box easy changes. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And of course, that's part of the issue with work and organizational psychology. We often focus on large organizations and large corporates, but we know that actually a large proportion of especially women work in more informal economies rather than sort of formal corporate structures. So absolutely trying to understand where the inequalities happen there, where there's no HR department, there's no senior leadership team. It really is looking at how individuals interact with each other, so how there might be support within groups of women, how that fits within family structures and village structures, for example, and then how, I guess, that more informal economy might then interact with more formal economies to get some of that work to market, for example, or get them into stores or get them sold. And I think there again, we've got very, very different issues and very different problems. And I thought one of the really interesting questions that often came up was around methodologies and about whether scales or measures that are developed in the US or in Europe and things like that, whether they work in Latin America. Are they appropriate? Do they measure the things that we want to measure? Are they useful? And often what happens is that people just translate those. So they translate existing scales into Spanish or into Portuguese and then, use them with participants. But there's a bigger question about whether that scale that's been validated in particular countries is actually valid and useful in Latin America. Maybe we need to measure different things or measure them in different ways. And it's not just about simply translating existing scales. Maybe we have to create our own scales to use in Latin America. And there's a real tension there because often editors and journals want established measures to be used, but if those established measures aren't useful, then I think that's a real problem. So I think we talked a lot about the tensions about getting good data versus getting validated data, but validated in contexts and countries that might not be appropriate. So my view on that is that we should absolutely be developing our own measures in Latin America, and that we need to push back against editors and journals who just demand simple translated scales. So we have to really make the point that sometimes those scales might work, but sometimes they might need either an adaptation or a rethink or new items to be developed. The other big question that I thought came up was the notion of intersectionality, especially when it comes to gender equality work. And again, I think it's a bit of a related point because I think a lot of the research that's been done has been done with particular types of women, often white women in professions in middle class or upper class areas. And I think it's really important to note that a lot of the interventions and a lot of the background research that's done is on quite a truncated sample, and that actually women of color, disabled women, queer women, Indigenous women might actually be facing different problems or exacerbated problems, and we need to be developing theories and methods and interventions that work for them. And actually, it's most important to lift up those that face the biggest inequalities rather than focusing our work on perhaps those that already hold the most privilege within women as well. So yeah, the literature is not really representative of the world and all different areas and remote things. Some of that I think is about ease of collecting data and things like that. I know when I was in Brazil, it was really interesting to talk to colleagues, and they said, well, our ethics mean that we can't pay participants. So actually collecting data is much harder. Getting the large sample sizes that are needed or getting longitudinal work is much harder. So, it's much easier to get a sample of 1,000 people if you can easily pay them on Prolific or something like that. So part of it is that. Part of it is that, most of the international journals, the high prestige journals are in English, and they are often based in Western countries and those sorts of things as well. And there are biases about what they publish and what samples they're interested in and even what methodologies and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think definitely getting the literature base as more representative of worldwide, including Latin America, but also including Asia, there's like Africa, there's lots of areas where I think we require much more data and understanding, and not just about having Europeans or US Americans going in and collecting data in those countries, but really the data coming from academics working in those regions.